is actually working. So let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today, our teacher, is Dr. John Kaltner. He is the chair and an associate professor of religious studies, and there's a title that is longer than that that I didn't write down.
We can dispense with it.
At Rhodes College. He'll be here for the this week and next week. I'm going to stand up and ask if there are any prayer requests or other announcements that we need to make. We're going to pray for Mary. Okay. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity to come back here in Sunday school in person for the first time in a long time as this class. And we ask that you speak to us through the leaders this semester so we might learn from your word. And we ask for your healing mercies upon Mary Edith and upon all those people who have COVID in our city and in the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everybody.
Great, well, thank you all, and it's a pleasure to be back here. It's been a few years since I've been here. It's a long year or two before COVID, so it's wonderful. Thank you again for the invitation. As you said, I'll be here for the next couple of weeks, and I want to share some thoughts and material with you related to the relationship between the Bible and the Quran. As you heard, I teach in the religious studies department. My two main areas of interest and research and training are biblical studies and then also Islam and the Quran, especially the relationship between the Bible and the Quran. So what we'll do is I'll begin with just a very brief overview of the Quran for those who might not be very familiar with the text of Islam. And then I have a handout. We're going to be looking at some texts both these weeks that focus on the issue of the divine attributes in the Quran. So how is God perceived? What are some of the main characteristics or qualities of God that are highlighted and focused on in the Quran? So again, just very briefly here, a few minutes on the Quran itself, and then we'll turn to these texts and spend time talking about them. So again, the Quran is the sacred text of Islam. The word Quran in Arabic simply means recitation. So it's something that is meant to be recited and proclaimed. It's obviously tied very closely to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in the years 570 to 632. And sometime around the time that he turned 40 years old, so around the year 610, he began to have what he and his followers came to see as revelations from God. And so what the Quran is, and those continued over the rest of his life. So for 22 years, he received these intermittent messages from God. And so the Quran is actually a compilation, a collection of what Muslims believe are these divine revelations to the Prophet Muhammad. The text is about the same length as the New Testament. It's about 6,300 verses, and it's divided up into 114 chapters. And the chapters run from the longest to the shortest chapter. There's an opening introductory chapter that's quite short, but then it runs generally in that way. So it's not chronological as much of the Bible is in terms of its arrangement. It's also in rhyme, so that every verse ends with a similar sound to the verses. Every verse in that chapter, the same chapter, ends with a similar verse. So, for example, here's that opening chapter in Arabic that is fairly brief. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العظيم. Now, even if you don't know Arabic, you hear all those eems over and over again. That's what the Quran is. It's this rhyming prose, is what it's called, throughout the entire text. So some chapters run to 200. And all of those 250 verses will end in a rhyming pattern like that. As you might imagine, it's really hard. In fact, it's impossible to duplicate that rhyming pattern. So that's why Muslims maintain that any translation of the Quran is really not the Quran. It's simply an interpretation of the text, because you can't really render that sound quality that's so important to the text. The word Islam means submission. In particular, submission to the will of God. So a Muslim is someone who does Islam, a submitter. And the message of God is perfectly preserved in the Quran. So what the Muslim is to submit to ideally is to that message as it is contained and found within the text of the Quran. Now, an important point for our purposes is that God, or Allah, which in Arabic simply means the deity, the God, Allah in the Quran makes it very clear that this is the same God as the God of the Bible. Now, again, that's very important for our purposes because we're going to be looking at how this God is perceived and presented in the two texts. A fascinating part of the Quran is that I would guess probably about 30% of it is related to the Bible in the sense that there are stories that are found in the Bible that have counterparts in the Quran. So it's quite interesting. There are about 30 characters who are named in the Quran who are also named in the Bible. And many of the stories that we find in the Quran about these characters have their equivalents in the biblical text. The major ones, the major figures are Adam, Noah, Moses, Abraham, Mary, mother of Jesus, Jesus himself, and then also Joseph, whose brothers sell him into Egypt. He has an entire chapter devoted to him in the Quran, chapter 12 of the Quran. And these Quran versions, it's interesting when we look at like stories in the Quran that are found in the Bible, what we find repeatedly is that they're really bare bones and they lack detail. What that suggests is that probably the original audience of the Quran would have been familiar with these biblical traditions. So there's no need to repeat all the details, but the Quran tends to focus right in on what the main point of the passage is. So probably we have no idea exactly how biblical material might have been present within Arabia in the 7th century, but based on the Quran, it looks like they did have some access to it, probably in oral traditions, because we have no evidence of the Quran being, the Bible being translated into Arabic until like the 8th century, long after Muhammad died. The other thing I'll point out about these biblically related stories in the Quran is that they're never presented in exactly the same way as we find in the Bible, and that's because they always are given an Islamic flavor. And we're going to see that very clearly when we look at these passages. They're presented in a way that coheres with what Islam teaches, and so there are always these little nuances and shifts that take place in the characters and what happens. And so it's a really quite fascinating aspect of the relationship between the two texts. So what we're going to be doing here these next couple of weeks is I'd like to look with you at Islamic notions of God and how they shape how the Quran tells some of these Bible stories, okay? And in particular, there are 3 defining qualities of God in the Quran where I think we can see this very nicely, right? So they are mercy. God is merciful more than anything else in the Quran. In fact, every chapter of the Quran but one begins with the words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. Only chapter 9 doesn't begin with that, but the other 113 do. So mercy is clearly to the fore. Another aspect is omnipresence. God is everywhere. God is present everywhere, and there's even when we don't realize it, the deity is engaged in human life. And then thirdly, unity. God is one. Nothing should violate that unity of God. Okay? So we're going to spend the time again looking at some passages in which we can see this at work. Notice those 3 things, obviously: mercy, omnipresence, and unity. Those are biblical concepts as well, right, when we think about God. But what's interesting is that, again, the Quran will present these, presents God's mercy and omnipresence and unity in slightly different ways than what we see in the biblical tradition. So today, we're going to consider the first 2 of those characteristics, okay? Time permitting, we have 4 passages that we'll look at, 2 for each. And then next week, we'll look at the question of unity. Now, the ones for today are really uncontroversial. Again, the God of the Bible is merciful, right? The God of the Bible is omnipresent. And so there's no real sense in which, there's a bit of tension between the Bible and the Quran on this matter. But next week, when we look at unity, that's where sort of the rubber hits the road, because the whole question of Jesus is highly problematic in the Quran. God is one in both the Bible and the Quran, but because of a certain understanding that Islam has about God's unity, the whole notion of incarnation and Trinity, those two concepts, are foreign to Islam and in fact anathema. And so things will be pretty comfortable this week, but next week we'll be looking at some texts that are very, very critical of really the basis of Christian belief. And so we are easing into this, so to speak. So I do have a handout here, and maybe I was optimistic I had more than enough, so I yeah, there are two texts on the front and two on the back. I think what we'll do is, just to make sure we touch on both of these concepts, we'll do, our first two will be one from each, one from the front and one from the back, and then we'll, time permitting, we'll look at the other two, or at least one of the other two if we can. These are only the Quran passages. All four of these texts are biblical stories that I'm assuming most of you will be fairly familiar with, and so we don't need to read the biblical passage. But I think it's important that we do read the Quran passage just so you have a clear sense of exactly what is going on, and so that you can appreciate how the Quran presents its material. Okay? So our first one is the Quran's, or one of the Quran's versions of the garden story. It's found in Genesis 2 and 3. So I'll read, and if you can follow along, we will, probably the best way to do this is, I'll read the text, I'll offer you some comments and thoughts on it, and then we'll just open it up for any questions or discussion that you might have, okay? So this is from chapter 7 of the Quran, verses 10 to 25. We have set you firmly in the earth and provided you with a livelihood, but you give little thanks. We created you and then gave you shape. Then we said to the angels, prostrate yourselves before Adam. And they all did so except Iblis, who was not among those who prostrated. God asked, what prevented you from prostrating when I ordered you? He replied, you created me of fire, but you created him of clay. God said, go down from here. You are not to be proud here. Leave. You are among those despised. Iblis said, grant to me a delay until the day they are raised up. God said, you are among those who are reprieved. Iblis then said, because you have caused me to err, I will surely lie in wait for them on your straight path. Then I will come upon them from the front and from behind, upon their right side and their left side. Then you will not find the majority of them thankful. God said, be gone, banished and driven away. As for those that follow you, I will surely fill hell with all of you. O Adam, you and your wife live in the garden and eat from where you wish, but do not approach this tree, or you will be among those who do wrong. But Satan whispered to them so that he might reveal to them what was hidden from them of their shame. He said, your Lord has forbidden you to approach this tree only to prevent you from becoming angels or immortals. Then he swore to them, I am truly among those who give honest advice to you. Thus did he guide them by deceit. Then when they had tasted of the tree, their nakedness became apparent to them, and they began to cover themselves with the leaves of the garden. Their Lord called out to them, did I not forbid you to approach the tree? And did I not warn you that Satan is a clear enemy to you? They replied, our Lord, we have harmed ourselves. If you do not forgive us and have mercy on us, we shall surely be among the lost. He said, go, some of you will be enemies of each other. For a while the earth will provide you a dwelling and life's necessities. There you shall live, and there you shall die, and from there you shall be brought out. Now the Quran, another interesting aspect of the Quran is that there are several versions of the garden story. This is the one that's closest to the Genesis text, so I think it works best for our purposes. A couple of thoughts. First of all, we have this interesting beginning story with this figure named Iblis. This is clearly like the fallen angel motif that we don't have in the Bible story, but is found in other early Jewish writings. For example, there's a text called The Life of Adam and Eve that goes back to probably as early as the 1st century of the Common Era, and there's this tradition about this fallen angel. So probably this suggests that early Muslims and whoever's putting the Quran together are familiar with this particular tradition. Similarities with Genesis 2 and 3. Obviously, we have a garden, right? We have the garden story. We have human creation from clay. We have the admonition not to eat from the tree. There's a deceitful agent who tricks the couple, right, to eat from the tree, claims to know what God's intent is. We have the covering of the nakedness. We have the final conversation with God, and then the departure, right? So clearly, it maps on very closely to what we have in Genesis 2 and 3. But there are some interesting differences, aren't there, right? There's no detailed account of human creation here, right? Humans just exist. There's no separate act of female creation. It looks like the two of them are created at the very same time. By the way, you might have caught this, but Eve is unnamed. In fact, in the entire Quran, only one woman is named in that 6,300 verses, and that's Mary, the mother of Jesus. Women are typically, there are many women in the Quran, but they are anonymous. They're often defined in relationship to a man or some title they have, like the Queen of Sheba is found in the Quran text. Eve in Genesis can sometimes be, the Genesis story is a classic example of the history of interpretation of it, using it to argue for the inferiority of women. Right, that men are superior. How is that so? She's created second, right? She's created from him. She's the one who's deceived. That's not the way this story presents the text, right? So we get a different sense of the relationship between the two members of the couple here in the Quran, as well as human responsibilities, right? There's no distinction between them as they act in tandem. In the Bible, Eve eats first, then she gives it to Adam, right? Here, they eat together. In fact, there's an interesting aspect of Arabic, and that is the grammatical form called the dual, which means whenever two people or two things are talked about, grammatically that's marked on a word, a verb or a noun. In this particular passage, there are 28 dual forms in about 10 verses. It's the highest concentration in the entire text. But what that does is it reinforces the idea that this couple is acting together, right? They share in this equally, and we really can't blame one or the other of them. And so it's, again, a very interesting aspect of the story. The agent of deceit. Who is it who's responsible for the couple's mistake here? Iblis, early in the story, morphs into Satan, you might have seen. Satan isn't mentioned in the biblical text. We tend to read Satan into that story, but in fact, it's simply a serpent, right? What is that serpent in Genesis? It is one of the creatures that God has made. In fact, the text says the serpent was the most crafty of the animals that God created. So what that suggests is that God is the one somehow, ultimately, who is responsible for the mess the couple find themselves in. The Quran doesn't do that. The Quran doesn't have some creature that God has made, but it's this more angelic being, this Iblis, who is the one responsible. And notice how that distances God's accountability, right? This is very Islamic, right? God, it's impossible for God to do anything wrong or make a mistake or be the cause of something that hurts humanity. And so by having Iblis as the agent of deceit, that maintains that, sort of that distance, if you will, on God's part. The outcome in the two stories is very interesting, right? In Genesis, you might recall, at the end of Genesis 3, all three of the parties are punished. It's wrong to say cursed, because only the serpent is cursed. But Adam has to work by the sweat of his brow. It's hard to work. Eve will experience pain in childbirth, and the serpent will have to crawl on its belly, right? They're all punished. The relationships are fractured. That's not what happens here, really, at all. In fact, there is no fall of humanity. There's no original sin, which, of course, Christianity introduces into that text. And so the Quran ends on a much more hopeful note. And why is it so hopeful? And here's the key point I would stress, is that it's because God's mercy is being underscored here in the Quranic account. In the Bible, this is a story about fractured relationships, right? What God creates falls apart. And in fact, it almost looks like maybe God doesn't really know what's going to happen or have full control, right? What does God do first when God realizes that Adam's alone? I'll create an animal companion, right? That doesn't work, so God has to go to plan B. Oh, I get it. I'll take something from his body and create a woman. This is a God who seems to be sort of learning as things develop. God asks the question, did you eat of the fruit of the tree I told you not to eat of? Well, it could be a rhetorical question, right? But it could also be a real question. God's wondering, did you disobey me, right? That would not fit the Quranic understanding of God. And the main quality of God is that is mercy. So this is a story where God's mercy comes to the fore. When Iblis is punished by God in this story, Iblis asks for mercy, and God does grant him mercy. When the couple, in the Bible, the couple never say, oh, it's our fault, and therefore please forgive us. But the Quran couple do say that. And what does God say? Okay, you will leave here for a while, but you will come back. In other words, God is merciful to them. So what we have here is, again, clearly the same story, but the message that's being presented and the image of God that comes across is strikingly different, isn't it? And this is something that we can see over and over again in the Quran. I teach a course, we'll be starting on Wednesday, I teach a course at Rhodes on the Quran and the Bible, and we basically do this throughout the whole semester, look at these stories. Students are struck repeatedly, especially those who know the Bible so well, by just how much more merciful the divine character of the Quran is than the God of the Bible. We'll see another example of that in just a few minutes. So what's going on here is that the Quran is Islamizing this tradition, right? And again, it's a very, very, very common thing. Notice, look at the very first verse. We have set you firmly in the earth and provided you with a livelihood, but you give little thanks. That you in Arabic is in the plural. So this story is directed to humanity. It's meant to teach a lesson for everyone, right? I've given you everything you need, but you don't appreciate it, right? And so in the Bible, it reads like it's a story about something that happened a long, long time ago, about the first couple. The Quran presents it in a way that, no, this is a lesson for everyone, regardless of when you're living and who you are. Listen to this and learn from this, right? And so there's sort of a more universalizing tendency in the Quran when these stories are told than what we typically find here. And the bottom line is that the main message, to me at least, is that everyone can experience divine mercy, right? It's not just about what happened long ago, but if you are thankful, right? You don't give thanks. If you are thankful, you can experience mercy. So I think I'm going to stop there, and maybe if anyone has any thoughts or questions on this text, we can talk a little bit more about it. Yes, you.
The similarities in this story, I'm assuming that the biblical version precedes by a couple hundred years.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Muhammad's revelation. Does that suggest that Muhammad was heavily influenced by Judaism or no?
Yeah, this is a really hotly debated topic, right? What did Muhammad know about Judaism and Christianity? We know with certainty that there was a very strong Jewish presence in the Arabian Peninsula during Muhammad's lifetime. So clearly, he would have come in contact with these traditions. Christian presence less so. And that might explain why we have so many more traditions related to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, than we do to the New Testament. But exactly what form that would have taken and who these Jews and possibly Christians might have been and how closely they held to what today is modern day, Judaism and Christianity, these are all open questions that scholars continue to debate. Yes?
So the story of Adam and Eve is Jewish creation myth.
Uh-huh.
Is there a traditional creation myth that Muhammad would have done before? I mean, this is not a creation myth, but is there a traditional creation myth that people have done?
Yeah, this particular text doesn't really have that, as you say, the same mythical qualities as we see elsewhere. But there are, as I mentioned, there are some other versions of the garden story where that's a little bit more to the fore.
Within the Quran?
Yes, yes. So I would say that probably the garden story does function in a way similar to, in Islam, similarly to the way it functions in Judaism and Christianity. But in this particular version, which is again the closest one to the biblical text, it doesn't quite come through in the same way. No. Yes.
Who is the we?
Ah, great. Thank you for asking that. I wanted to mention that. Yeah, it's the very first word, isn't it? Yeah. This is a common practice in the Quran where God will actually speak. The Quran is considered to be God's actual words to Muhammad, and so these are actually the divine words. So God sometimes speaks in the singular, I, but often adopts the we, the plural, and sometimes will do it both in the same verse. And so this is simply commonly understood to be what's referred to as either the divine we or the royal we that we sometimes see. For example, we do see in the Bible, in Genesis, not in the garden story, but in Genesis 1:28, I think, God says, let us create them in our image. So we see, so it's in no way meant to suggest that there's a multiplicity of gods here, but rather it's just a conventional way of speaking within the Quran. But I appreciate that question. Thanks.
Was he the sole author of the Quran?
Well, according to
Where did he come from? What was his education or his background?
we do have biographies of Muhammad. Unfortunately, the earliest one we have was written a good century after his life. So by this time, of course, who knows how much legend and non-historical information has been revealed to it. But according to that biography, he was an illiterate person who could not read or write. And this is one way of trying to argue that the Quran could not have been copied. But of course, it doesn't say he was deaf, so he could have heard these traditions, and then they played a role. But according to traditional Islamic teaching, the Quran contains the literal words of God, so that Muhammad was simply an instrument. The angel Gabriel plays a role in being the intermediary between God and Muhammad, and then the text of the Quran that we have, again, according to Islam, these are the verbatim words of God. Now, of course, scholars, challenge this, and they've studied the text very carefully, including, some growing numbers of Muslim scholars who sort of challenge or push back on that traditional view, but that is kind of the main narrative for how it came to be.
Well, if he was illiterate, who wrote it down?
Yes, it circulated orally. It was an oral-based culture during his lifetime, but then as he got older, it was written down on various objects and materials, and eventually only after his death, again, according to this traditional account, was it brought together and then preserved, again, through the agency of God in its perfect form. Let's turn to the other side of the page, just so we can, let's see, which one should we do? Let's do the Moses birth story. This is one of my favorites because it's just so interesting. So we've been looking at divine mercy. Now we want to see an example of divine omnipresence, right? And so this is from Quran chapter 28. Its equivalent is Genesis 2, 1-10. And in Quran 28, we read the following. There's that we again, right? We relate to you in truth the story of Moses and Pharaoh for a people who believe. Truly, Pharaoh was master over the land and divided its people into different groups. He weakened one group of them by slaying their sons and allowing their women to live. Truly, he was one of the evildoers. We wish to show favor to those who were weakened in the land, to make them leaders and heirs, and to establish them in the land, to make Pharaoh, Haman, and their legions see from them what they feared. We announced to Moses' mother, suckle him, and if you fear for him, toss him into the river. Do not fear or grieve, for we will restore him to you and make him one of the messengers. Pharaoh's family picked him up, and he became an enemy and cause of sorrow for them. Truly, Pharaoh, Haman, and their legions were sinners. Pharaoh's wife said, he will be a joy for me and for you. Do not kill him. Perhaps he will be of some use to us, or we may take him as a son. They were not aware of what was going to happen. Moses' mother became anxious, and she was about to reveal it had we not strengthened her heart in order that she might be a believer. She said to his sister, follow him. So she watched him from a distance, and they were unaware. We had already caused him to refuse the wet nurses, so she said, shall I direct you to a household that will raise him for you and take care of him? Thus we returned him to his mother so that she might have joy and not grieve, and in order that she might know that Allah's presence is true, although most do not know. We do have one other account of Moses' birth in chapter 20 of the Quran. It's a shortened version, and it follows more or less along the same lines. Here too we have certain similarities, right? In Egyptian setting, there's a ruthless pharaoh who is harming people of Israel. There's a river. There's rescue by Pharaoh's family. Return to the mother through the sister, right? So again, very same story, clearly in the outline. We do have differences. Here, it's Pharaoh's wife rather than Pharaoh's daughter, as in the Bible. It's Pharaoh's daughter who finds the child. The mother doesn't return the child to Pharaoh according to this text, whereas in the Bible she does. And then we have this strange character named Haman, who's not mentioned in the text of the Bible. Is anyone familiar with the Haman in the Bible?
He's in Esther.
The book of Esther, yeah, book of Esther, there's a guy named Haman who is an enemy of the Jews. In fact, he wants to put the Jews to death. And so, now Muslims would say, well, no, this is the correct version of the story, right? But some non-Muslims, and even maybe a few Muslims, would say that maybe this reflects some sort of confusion with the Haman that's in the book of Esther. Hard to really know for sure. But the biggest difference in this story is clearly the role that God plays. This is an omnipresent God, right? The mother puts the child into the river because God tells her to, right? And by the way, did you notice what's missing in this story? The basket. She puts him in the river. Right? So she's exhibiting. Now, in the other one, there is a basket, the other Quran story. But she's exhibiting a level of confidence and trust that is quite remarkable. In fact, she's told to do some contradictory things, right? Feed your child, like any good parent would, and then throw him in the river. Right? And she does so. But she does it because God tells her to do it, right? And then when she gets a little bit, she's about to spill the beans, it says in the text that in verse 10 that God strengthens her heart, right? So God actually makes sure that the mother is able to do what needs to be done. In addition, the sister follows him out of obedience to God, right? And then maybe the most interesting thing is that in verse 12, it says that the child doesn't eat because God has already caused him to refuse the wet nurses. So God has control over the eating habits of the infant, right? So God's fingerprints are all over this story. Every one of the characters is somehow being, sort of influenced by God and the divine presence. And here's the really interesting thing, and I would not be surprised if most of you don't realize this, but if you go back and look at Genesis 2, verses 1 to 10, God is not mentioned a single time in the story of Moses' birth. Not once. God never appears. We tend to read God into that story or assume, oh, God's working behind the scenes, but the text never really says that. Right? By the way, one of the reasons why it doesn't say that is perhaps because this originally wasn't the story of Moses, but there's a text, an ancient Mesopotamian text that goes back to the figure who's mentioned lived in the 18th century BCE, a guy named Sargon, and the birth story of Sargon is a very similar story to this, in that his mother puts him in a basket to protect him and puts him on a river. So possibly going on here with the biblical text is dependent upon that earlier Mesopotamian text where God isn't mentioned. And so it isn't really referred to. God is referred to in this story. But the Quran, whoever's responsible for the Quran story, injects this divine presence that's overpowering and dominating everything. God's pulling the strings all over the place in that story, right? And why is that? I would suggest again, it's because that's what Islam believes about God, right? God is everywhere. God is always involved, even when you think God is not, somehow influencing things and concerned, that God is that way. And so, so I think this Islamization here is seen in the heavy presence of God. It's also seen, by the way, if you look at verse 7, there's a reference here to, we will restore him to you, this is God speaking to the mother, and make him one of the messengers. That word messenger is really a technical term in Islam. The Arabic word is rasul, which means an apostle or a messenger. And the messengers are chosen by God, and there are only a handful of them in the Quran, Moses being a prime example. So here, this is another way that the text is being Islamized, so that God is in a sense telling the mother that your son is going to be, among this rare group of people who have been chosen to be my messengers. So again, I really like this story, the Quran version, because it really does, I think, in a very, very clear way, show the agenda of the Quran when we compare it with the biblical text. And quite honestly, I tell you, I had heard the biblical story probably hundreds of times in my life until only when I read the Quran and started to look at it in relationship to the Bible, did it ever dawn on me that, wait a minute, God's not mentioned here in Genesis. Again, we tend to just read that into the text. Any thoughts on that passage?
The perspective is kind of different, that God is telling the story. So like he's in all this stuff, he explains why he's doing things.
Yes, that's a very good point. That in fact, because these are the literal words of God according to Islam, God is communicating directly to the reader and to the audience. And so, like here, we notice on the first one it was, we have set you firmly. Here it's, we relate to you. The Quran is very clearly always intentional about this being God communicating to people. Another very common phrase that we see at the beginning of stories, especially stories that are recounting the lives of biblical characters, is remember. Remember when Joseph was sold into Egypt by his brothers and that sort of thing. Remember Mary and what she did. It's like constantly, there's almost like this, again, clear communication from the deity to humanity, which you don't get in the Bible, right? You do get, for example, in the prophetic literature, thus says the Lord, right? But still, that's the prophet speaking, right? And quoting God, but you rarely get God speaking directly to humanity in the Bible. And in the Quran, that's all it is. It's just that. So it's a very different register of communication.
That lack of basket is a problem.
Lack of a basket? Yeah. Well, here too, I don't want to read too much into this and say, okay, yeah, she literally threw them in, but it's probably, once again, we do have another Quran version in 20 where there is a basket, first of all. And secondly, as I said earlier, the Quran is very sparse in its details, probably because the readership and the original audience knew these stories, so they would have read a basket into it, even if it's not there. But you could read this story, and this is in keeping very much in line with Islamic teaching, that the mother was so faithful that she trusted God to such a degree that she just put him in the water, and somehow miraculously he survived. But you're right, it's an unusual part of that story. By the way, while I'm thinking of the Sargon story, Sargon was, he ruled in an area of modern day Iraq, and Saddam Hussein, of course, who has been dead for quite a few years now, but he ruled with an iron fist in Iraq for many years, and he always saw himself as sort of, rooted in this tradition of Sargon and all these great Mesopotamian leaders, to the degree that there were places, that there were images in Iraq while Saddam Hussein was in power of the Sargon story with the child in the basket, but the face of the child was Saddam Hussein's face. And I don't know if have a mustache, but he identified so strongly that, his predecessors, that he actually read himself into the story.
I think it's interesting that it says that Pharaoh he ruled over the land and divided its people into different groups. He moved into one group of them. It doesn't say these are the Israelites, the Hebrews. It says he divided the people of that land. It's interesting. I thought.
It is. It really is. And there too is that, the author assumes, well, they know the background of the story, or is there some other way of understanding, especially with the introduction of Haman, and, is there some sort of influence from, other biblical texts or stories and traditions that are, kind of having an impact on this story? But yeah, you're quite right. It's like the biblical story, but not exactly.
So, Dr. Faulkner, you mentioned a couple of times in both of these passages that this is not the only appearance of these stories within the Quran. I'm curious, so in the Christian tradition, we can look at the four Gospels and say, well, they tell the same story from different perspectives, and they have different authors. So it's kind of easy to look at the book of John, the book of Mark, the book of Luke, and say, well, these are all written by different people, that's why they're a little different. That's not as easy in Islam, I would assume. So what is the scholarly consensus regarding the existence of multiple tellings of the same story? Then maybe what is the Islamic consensus?
Yeah, that's a great question. Generally speaking, when we look at the different versions, and most of the time they'll have, well, I shouldn't say that. There are some places where we have 5 or 6 different versions, but they're different lengths. And so Muslims would say, well, no, this is all the same story, but it's just being, different parts of it are being, sort of emphasized or mentioned here, but if you put the whole thing together, it all fits perfectly. I think what's going on there is really same stories being told, but this gets at the difference between the Quran and the Bible in terms of its purpose. The Bible is very much a narration in many places that's meant to recount these events from the past, right? And then later readers will somehow interpret them and try to gain meaning from them. The Quran is much more intentional about taking the same story and then presenting it in somewhat different ways so that different lessons or messages are highlighted, so that the focus is not on the story per se, but on what the story means. And so that, I think, is what's going on here. So for example, in this garden story, the one that we looked at, the emphasis is very much on human beings forgetting, right? That you're not being faithful to, to what you're called to be. You look at other versions of the garden story, and that's different. The emphasis is more on, well, here's how the world came about, right? And so, so I think that's probably for my mind, the best way to understand why we get these different traditions. But I think the analogy with the Gospels is a helpful one. You've got four different versions of the same story, and the Christology of each Gospel is different, right? And it's telling similar stories but in different ways to highlight certain aspects of it. And I think a similar sort of thing is happening in the Quran, even though Muslims would stop short of saying, well, that's because there are different authors. Because for the believing Muslim, no, there's really no author. These are God's words. Let's stick with the idea of God's omnipresence, and take a look at the Cain and Abel story. I think this will work better for us too, because it's a shorter text, and we can get through it easier and talk a little bit about it. Here too, we have God's omnipresence highlighted, but in a somewhat different way. This is from chapter 5, and by the way, this is the only version of the Cain and Abel story that we have. Tell them in truth the story of Adam's 2 sons. When they presented an offering, it was accepted from one of them, but it was not accepted from the other. The one said, "Truly I will kill you." The other said, "God accepts from the pious. If you extend your hand against me to kill me, I will not extend mine to kill you. I fear God, the Lord of the universe. I wish you would bear the sin committed against me and your other sins and be among the people of the fire, for that is the reward of those who are wrongdoers." His mind aided him in the killing of his brother, so he killed him and became one of the lost ones. Then God sent a raven that scratched on the ground in order to show him how to bury his brother's corpse. He cried, "Woe is me! Am I unable to be like this raven and bury my brother's corpse?" Then he became repentant. Because of this, we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever killed a person, except in the cases of punishment for murder or causing corruption in the land, it would be as if he had killed all people. And whoever saved a person, it would be as if he had saved all people. Our messengers came to them with clear signs, but even after that, many of them have done evil in the land. So here too, maybe a little less clearly, we see the same basic outline of the Cain and Abel story that we have in the Bible, but let's see here. There we go. But there are some interesting differences, right? First of all, you don't have any details on the brothers. No occupations in the Bible. One is a farmer, the other is a herder, right? You don't get what their offerings are. In fact, you can read this text as if they both brought the same offering, and God takes that offering from one, but not from the other. And then, curiously, no names. They are the sons of Adam, not Eve, Adam and Eve, just Adam. And so they're shorn of all individual identity, right? They're just two brothers. The only thing we know about them is their father's name and their relationship as brothers. By the way, they do have names elsewhere in Islam. They're called Habil and Qabil, Cain and Abel, in other Islamic sources, but not here in the Quran. So what this means is we're invited to read them more as symbolic figures rather than actual people and individuals, right? And so that suggests that, and here too, that the Quran is more interested in presenting a message rather than retelling events from the past, right? And what is that message? Well, notice the way these two brothers interact with each other. You know, the killer says, "I'm going to kill you." That's pretty blunt, right? In the Bible, Cain kills Abel, but Cain says, "Hey, bro, let's go for a walk. All right, let's go for a walk in the field," and there he kills him. But it never is that as blunt as here, right? So this gives the brother who's about to be killed a chance to respond. And what does he say? You know, "Well, if you kill me, I'm not going to harm you." And in fact, God, goes on to say that basically, God will be with me because I'm not one of the evil ones. I'm not one of the wrongdoers, as he says. And so this encounter between the two brothers, clearly, they have this conversation, but they never have a conversation in the Bible. It's one of them speaks. Abel never speaks in the Bible. He simply, is killed, and then that's basically it, right? But notice how God's role is downplayed in this text. In the Bible, God talks to Cain, the killer, beforehand and says, "Why are you downcast?" And they have this conversation. Sin is lurking at your door, God says. So the brother almost has a warning that, he needs to sort of shape up here, right? The conversation with the brothers in the Quran plays a similar role, but not exactly, identical, right? But here in the Quran, while God's role is downplayed early on, God comes on the scene later on, right? And notice how, what does God do? God sends the raven, right? That story is not in the Bible, but that raven becomes the opportunity for the brother, the killer, to recognize what he's done, right? And he says, "Woe is me, I can't even bury my brother like this bird can do," right? And that becomes the springboard for him then to get on the right path, right? In the Bible, you don't get that. In fact, he never repents in the Bible. He asks for a sign so he'll be protected, but he never acknowledges that he's done anything wrong. So in other words, The brother in the Quran recognizes what the brother in the Bible never does. He knows, I am my brother's keeper, right? And I've done something horrible to my brother. But why does he do that? It's because God sends the bird. But here's the really interesting thing. In the Quran, the brother never knows that God sends the bird. The reader knows, but the brother just sees the bird, right? So he never realizes that the only reason the bird comes is because God has sent the bird. So here too, we see this idea of divine omnipresence, right? God always there and involved, but in a much more subtle way. And for the reader, then the question becomes, well, okay, well, where is God in my life when I think God is not here, right? And it causes one to sort of reflect on the possibility that even when it seems like there is no divine presence in my life, that in fact, there might be. And so this is a little more subtle in terms of, compared to the Moses birth story, in terms of how God's presence is seen. But in some ways, I think it speaks more powerfully to human beings, who, let's be honest, much of the time, maybe most of the time, we don't necessarily feel that presence, right? And this story is sort of meant to be a reminder for the reader. The killer thinks he's come to this insight on his own, but in fact, it's only because God has done it. By the way, there is a Jewish text where we have a similar story. It's not in the Bible, but it's a text that describes how Adam and Eve are mourning the death of their son, and a bird comes along. Actually, a bird kills another bird and then buries it. And this then becomes their way of knowing this is what we are supposed to do with our son's corpse. And then they bury him. And so here too, we, in all likelihood, have some sort of familiarity or awareness of in this case, an extra biblical tradition. As also here, if we look at verse 32, it says, because of this, we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever killed a person, except in the cases of punishment for murder or causing corruption, it would be as if he had killed all people, and whoever saves one, as if he saved all people. That is one of the clearest examples, maybe the clearest example in the Quran, of a quotation from a Jewish source, because this comes from, it's not in the Bible, but it's in the Mishnah, which is a collection of writings that are a commentary on the Bible, and that is almost verbatim what we find in the Mishnah. So here is clear evidence, in the view of most scholars, that that the Quran does have familiarity with the with some Jewish and Christian texts and sources. But here too, I think the fascinating thing is that, here the notion is that the deity is always present, even though seemingly absent, and we can never really know for sure. No. Any comments or questions on that passage?
Why do you think they chose a raven?
Sorry?
Why do you think they chose, instead of just a bird?
Oh, right, yeah.
Why did they pick raven? Because to me, raven has not a really favorable connotation.
That's a good point. It's actually the Arabic word there can also mean a crow. Could be it's sort of like a blackbird, which also is, yeah. So, but it's, I don't know, it's a good question. You're right, there are certain, at least in our culture, there are certain associations that we have with ravens and crows that perhaps make this seem like a little, strange story. But I don't know, and I don't recall that the Muslim commentators really discuss it much either. No. All right, well, we're almost out of time. I would encourage you to, let me say one other thing. We did not get to the golden calf story. This too, if you have some time, it's in Genesis 32, and you can hang on to this sheet. I would encourage you to read this passage and then read the Genesis story with this idea of, in this case, mercy, divine mercy being to the fore. Because what you will see will truly be astounding, because it's, again, the same story, but it's totally transformed. Because whereas in the Bible, this is a story of just relationships falling apart. In the Quran, it's the exact opposite, because God God basically shows mercy to every human being in that story. So there too, we see in a very, very nice way how the Islamization of these biblical traditions is at work. And then for next week, as I mentioned, things will be different there. We're not going to be looking at stories in the Quran as much as texts that are, I guess you could say, laying out the theology of Islam, but in a very aggressive way, in that they are challenging basic presuppositions of Christianity. We might look at a text. There are any number of texts where we can do that. We'll look at some of them. We may also look at the story of Jesus' birth in there, only because it's a very interesting one. And Mary is highlighted, and it raises some, I think, important questions about possible Christian sources for the Quran. So that's something that we'll pick up on. So if you have any chance and you want to prepare anything for class next week, I'd say maybe just take a look at the probably the story of Luke, the birth story, Luke 1 and 2. That would be closest to what we'll see in the Quran. Great, thank you all, and appreciate your attention and some great questions.
Not sure.